The massive amphitheater of the Galactic Council hummed with anticipation, its curved walls lined with representatives from 47 different species. Qorth Bellman adjusted his ceremonial robes, his 6 tentacles arranging themselves in what his people considered the posture of academic authority. Today would be his masterpiece, the presentation that would cement his reputation as the galaxy's foremost expert on primitive civilizations. Esteemed colleagues, Qorth began, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who had never been wrong about anything ever. Today I present to you the most comprehensive study ever conducted on the species known as humans. The holographic display behind him flickered to life, showing his first slide in bold, condescending letters, human species, a study in primitive behavior. A few appreciative clicks and chirps echoed from the audience. The Zephyrians nodded their crystalline heads approvingly, while the Mukhtar delegation exchanged knowing glances. "Now, I know what you're thinking," Qorth continued, his tone dripping with the kind of confidence that could only come from someone who had spent years studying creatures he considered barely above pond scum. How primitive could they possibly be? Well, my friends, prepare to be amazed by the sheer simplicity of these barely evolved primates. He clicked to his next visual, showing grainy footage of humans in what appeared to be some sort of conflict. Observe their technology, still using projectile weapons. Can you imagine? In the year 2387, while we harness the power of quantum manipulation, these creatures are still throwing metal at each other at high velocities. It's almost charming, in a pathetic sort of way. The audience erupted in polite laughter. The Vorthan ambassador actually slapped his knee equivalent, which was quite the compliment in academic circles. "But wait, there's more," Qorth exclaimed, clearly enjoying himself. "Their emotional responses are so predictable, so mechanical. Show them something they disagree with, and they'll either attack it or run away from it. No nuance, no sophisticated analysis, just pure animal instinct." He gestured dramatically toward the display, where charts showed human behavioral patterns. "Look at these response times. When faced with a threat, they react within milliseconds. No consideration, no consultation with their hive mind, no proper deliberation. It's like watching insects." The laughter grew louder, but Qorth's attention was suddenly drawn to a small section in the back of the amphitheater. There, sitting alone in a row that should have been empty, was a human. A single, solitary human female in what appeared to be some sort of uniform. Captain Maria Santos, according to his briefing notes, though he hadn't really expected her to actually show up. Most species sent observers to these academic presentations, but they usually had the decency to look embarrassed when their species was being dissected for entertainment. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even taking notes. She was just sitting there, perfectly still, watching him with those unnervingly steady eyes that seemed to be cataloging every word he spoke, every gesture he made, every breath he took. Their predictable emotional responses, Qorth continued, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Something about her complete stillness was unsettling. Where was the outrage? Where was the defensive posturing? Where was the typical primitive response to having one's species insulted? Instead, Captain Santos simply sat there, hands folded in her lap, expression neutral, as if she were watching a mildly interesting documentary about weather patterns. For the first time in his illustrious career, Qorth Bellman felt a tiny flutter of uncertainty in his stomach. But surely, he reasoned, this was just more evidence of human primitiveness. They probably didn't even understand when they were being insulted. Little did he know how wrong he was about to be. Qorth clicked to his second slide with renewed confidence, determined to ignore the unsettling human in the back row. "Now, let's examine their military capabilities," he announced, his voice regaining its pompous tone. And I use the term capabilities very loosely. The holographic display showed footage of what appeared to be human soldiers engaged in some sort of skirmish. Qorth zoomed in on their equipment with the enthusiasm of a child showing off a particularly disgusting bug collection. "Look at this," he exclaimed, pointing at a human carrying what looked like a metal tube. "They're still using kinetic projectiles. While we've mastered plasma weaponry and quantum disruptors, These creatures are essentially throwing rocks at each other. Very fast, very expensive rocks, but rocks nonetheless. The audience chuckled appropriately. The hegemony representative made a note on his tablet, probably something about trade restrictions. And their tactics. Qorth continued, warming to his subject. Observe how they move in these formations. It's like watching ancient tribal warfare, but with slightly shinier sticks. No coordination with orbital support, no real-time quantum communication, and no adaptive battlefield AI. They literally use their voices to communicate during combat. Their voices. As if shouting "look out" could somehow improve their survival odds. He paused for effect, expecting more laughter, but noticed something that made his primary stomach lurch. In the back row, Captain Santos had quietly opened a small device. Not a standard council-issued tablet, but something sleek and unfamiliar. Her fingers moved across its surface with practiced efficiency, and she appeared to be taking notes. While he systematically insulted her entire species. The footage you're seeing, Qorth continued, but his voice carried a slight tremor now, is from their most recent conflicts. As you can see, they haven't evolved beyond their primitive. He squinted at his data timestamp. Wait, this is from 3 months ago. That was unusually recent for an academic presentation. Most xenobiological studies used data that was years, sometimes decades old. Behavioral patterns didn't change that quickly in primitive species. Did they? Ambassador Crix Yendel, the council moderator, leaned forward with interest. 3 months? That's quite recent for a comprehensive behavioral analysis, isn't it, Professor Bellman? Yes, well, Qorth's tentacles fidgeted nervously. I wanted to ensure the most up-to-date information for such an important presentation. But that wasn't entirely true. His research team had specifically requested recent data, claiming that older human behavioral patterns were somehow incomplete. At the time, he'd assumed it was just academic thoroughness. Professor, came a voice from the Zephyrian section. What's your sample size for this analysis? Qorth glanced at his notes, then back at the screen. Approximately, well, these particular conflicts represent about 12,000 individual combat encounters. And the geographic distribution? Primarily concentrated in, he realized he didn't actually know. His research assistants had compiled the data, various Earth-based locations. In the back row, Captain Santos continued her quiet note-taking, occasionally glancing up at the presentation with an expression that could only be described as professional interest. Not anger, not embarrassment, but the kind of focused attention a scientist might give to a particularly fascinating specimen. Which, Qorth realized with growing unease, was exactly what he was to her. Professor Bellman, another voice called out, have you verified these tactical assessments with current military doctrine? Current military doctrine? Qorth's voice cracked slightly. These are primitive beings. What military doctrine could they possibly have that would be relevant to galactic standards? The question hung in the air like a toxic gas cloud. Several council members exchanged glances, and Qorth noticed that Captain Santos had paused in her note-taking to look directly at him. Not with anger, not with hurt feelings, but with something far more unsettling. She looked interested, as if he were confirming something she'd suspected all along. For the first time in his career, Qorth Bellman felt like he was being studied. Qorth's third slide materialized with what he hoped was authoritative confidence, though his tentacles were beginning to betray him with subtle tremors. Now, let's examine the biological limitations that make humans such a manageable species, he announced, clicking through anatomical diagrams that should have been reassuring in their simplicity. Consider their pathetically short lifespans, he began, his voice attempting to regain its earlier smugness. 70, maybe 80 rotations around their star if they're lucky. Compare that to our own species' average of 300 cycles, or the eternal collective's millennium-long existence. They barely have time to accumulate wisdom before they expire. The holographic display showed comparative lifespan charts, and Qorth felt a momentary return of his academic confidence and their physical fragility. Look at this cross-section of human bone density. A strong breeze could probably snap them in half. No natural armor, no regenerative capabilities, no redundant organ systems. They're essentially walking meat bags held together by wishful thinking and primitive medical intervention. But as he gestured toward the anatomical display, his peripheral vision caught something that made his primary heart skip several beats. Captain Santos wasn't just taking notes anymore. She was wearing something on her wrist that definitely hadn't been there at the beginning of his presentation. The device was small, sleek, and completely unfamiliar. It emitted a soft, barely perceptible glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with something. And as Qorth watched in growing horror, he realized that the device appeared to be scanning the entire amphitheater. Their sensory capabilities are equally primitive, he continued, but his voice was starting to crack. Limited visual spectrum, poor hearing range, practically no electromagnetic sensitivity. They can't even detect basic radiation levels without crude instruments. It's like they're walking around in a sensory fog, completely oblivious to the rich tapestry of information that surrounds them. The scanning device on Santos' wrist pulsed again, and she glanced at it with the casual interest of someone checking the time. But Qorth noticed that her gaze swept across the audience in a systematic pattern, as if she were cataloging every species present, every individual, every potential threat or ally. The most amusing aspect of human psychology. Qorth stammered, losing his train of thought as he watched her methodical observation, is their complete predictability. Show them a challenge, and they'll respond with either aggression or retreat. Show them something unknown, and they'll either try to dominate it or run away from it. There's no sophisticated analysis, no. Captain Santos reached into her uniform and pulled out a small tablet, not the device she'd been using before, but something even more compact and advanced-looking. Her fingers moved across its surface with practiced efficiency, typing what appeared to be a single message. The action itself was simple, almost mundane. But something about the way she did it, the calm precision, the complete lack of emotional response to his continued insults, made Qorth's skin crawl with inexplicable dread. She was reporting to someone about something. Even no complex behavioral patterns, Qorth continued weakly, his carefully rehearsed presentation crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. Just simple stimulus and response. Like laboratory animals. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, an embarrassing physiological response that his species typically reserved for life-threatening situations. His tentacles were now visibly shaking, and he could feel moisture gathering in the creases of his ceremonial robes. The audience was beginning to notice. Ambassador Crix Yendel leaned forward with obvious concern, while several representatives began murmuring among themselves. The Mukhtar delegation exchanged what appeared to be worried glances, and even the usually stoic hegemony representative seemed to be taking notes about Qorth's increasingly erratic behavior. "Professor Bellman," came a voice from the audience, "are you feeling all right? You seem distressed." Qorth tried to compose himself, but his gaze kept drifting back to Captain Santos, who had finished typing her message and was now sitting in that same unnervingly calm position, hands folded, watching him with those steady eyes that seemed to see right through his academic pretensions. "I'm fine," he managed to croak, though he was clearly anything but fine. Let's move on to the final slide." The final slide that would either save his career or destroy it completely. With trembling tentacles that he could no longer control, Qorth clicked to his final slide. The holographic display flickered momentarily, as if even the technology could sense his growing panic, before stabilizing to show his concluding recommendation in bold, authoritative letters: recommended galactic policy, benevolent oversight of human development. In conclusion, Qorth began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I believe the evidence clearly demonstrates that humans require careful guidance from more advanced civilizations. They are, after all, like children playing with dangerous toys, left to their own devices. They might accidentally hurt themselves or others." His hands shook so violently that the presentation remote nearly slipped from his grasp. Sweat was now flowing freely down his face, creating dark stains on his ceremonial robes that would have been humiliating under normal circumstances. But these were far from normal circumstances. We must consider them a protected species, he continued, his words coming out in a rushed, panicked stream. Like rare animals in a preserve. Beautiful in their simplicity, but requiring constant supervision to prevent them from making catastrophic decisions that could affect galactic stability. The audience was no longer paying attention to his words. Every eye in the amphitheater was focused on the growing spectacle of his psychological breakdown, the way his academic composure was crumbling like ancient parchment in a fire. And then, in the profound silence that followed his stammering conclusion, came a sound that seemed to echo through the vast chamber like thunder. Click. Here. Captain Santos had closed her tablet. The soft, almost insignificant sound of a device shutting down somehow commanded more attention than all of Qorth's bombastic presentation combined. It was a sound of finality, of completion, of a task accomplished with quiet efficiency. She stood up. EK. The movement was slow, deliberate, controlled. Not the explosive anger that Qorth had expected, not the defensive posturing that his research had predicted, but something far more terrifying. She rose from her seat with the fluid grace of a predator who had finished observing its prey and was now ready to act. Every being in the amphitheater turned to watch her. The Zephyrians stopped their constant crystal chiming, the Mokhtar delegations ceased their whispered conversations. Even the eternally fidgeting Vorthan representative went completely still. It was as if her simple act of standing had somehow shifted the entire gravitational center of the room. Qorth's mind reeled as the implications hit him like a quantum cascade failure. She had been recording everything. Every word, every gesture, every species present, every reaction from the audience. His primitive subject had been conducting her own study, gathering intelligence on the entire Galactic Council while he unknowingly performed like a trained animal for her analysis. The scanning device on her wrist, the advanced tablet, the systematic observation of every delegate, the careful documentation of his presentation. It wasn't the behavior of a primitive being attending an academic lecture. It was the methodical work of a professional intelligence operative conducting a comprehensive reconnaissance mission. And he had been the unwitting star of her show. She's been studying us, Qorth whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. All this time I thought I was the researcher. But she's been, by the 7 moons of Zephyria, she's been analyzing everything. Captain Santos hadn't spoken a single word since arriving. Not one protest, not one defensive comment, not one emotional outburst. Her complete silence had been more devastating than any angry rebuttal could have been. She had let him condemn himself with his own words, let him expose his ignorance, his arrogance, his complete failure to understand what he was dealing with. Her silence was psychological warfare of the highest order. Qorth's presentation had dissolved into incoherent stammering. His carefully prepared conclusion, his recommendations for galactic policy, his entire academic reputation, and everything was crumbling as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. He wasn't studying a primitive species. He was being studied by one that had effortlessly outmaneuvered him at every turn. The human in the back row hadn't come to observe his presentation. She had come to observe him, and everyone else in the room. And now, with her quiet efficiency and terrifying competence, she had completed her mission while he had unknowingly provided her with a comprehensive analysis of galactic attitudes toward her species. Captain Santos took one step forward, her movement measured and purposeful, and Qorth felt his legs give out completely. He collapsed into his chair, his presentation forgotten, his career in ruins, his worldview shattered by the simple act of a human standing up. She still hadn't said a word, and somehow, that was the most terrifying thing of all. Captain Santos began walking toward the podium with the same measured pace she had used to stand up. Each step echoed through the amphitheater with deliberate precision, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the panicked beating of Qorth's hearts. Her approach was unhurried, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its calm efficiency. Qorth scrambled away from the presentation area like a small animal fleeing a natural disaster. His tentacles tangled around themselves in his haste to retreat, and he nearly tripped over his own ceremonial robes in his desperation to put distance between himself and the approaching human. His academic confidence hadn't just been shattered, it had been vaporized so thoroughly that not even subatomic particles remained. I should probably, he babbled to no one in particular, his voice cracking like adolescent vocal cords. Perhaps we could schedule a follow-up session, or maybe review the methodology, or… Captain Santos reached the podium and turned to face the audience for the first time. Her expression remained neutral, professional, almost bored. She pulled out the same advanced device that had been recording Qorth's presentation and connected it to the amphitheater's holographic display system. The connection was seamless. Not the fumbling, multiple-attempt process that most species required when interfacing with Council technology, but a smooth, effortless integration that suggested intimate familiarity with systems that should have been completely foreign to a primitive species. Her first slide appeared instantly, its crisp clarity making Qorth's earlier presentation look like cave paintings by comparison. The title read, in the same bold lettering he had used, Human Species, a Correction of Misconceptions. The silence in the amphitheater was absolute. Even the usual background hum of the environmental systems seemed to have quieted in anticipation. Without speaking, Captain Santos clicked to her next slide. The display showed real-time footage of human military operations, but these weren't the crude, primitive conflicts that Qorth had mocked. These were sophisticated, coordinated campaigns involving technology that made the Council's own military capabilities look quaint. Orbital bombardment platforms that could sterilize entire continents with surgical precision. Faster-than-light communication networks that allowed instantaneous coordination across galactic distances. Adaptive artificial intelligence systems that could analyze and counter enemy strategies in real time. And all of it was recent. Not years old, not decades old, but footage time-stamped within the last few months. The next slide showed scientific breakthroughs that Qorth had somehow completely missed in his research. Humans had apparently solved the unified field theory while he was busy analyzing their primitive bone density. They had developed quantum consciousness transfer technology while he was mocking their short lifespans. They had achieved practical immortality while he was lecturing about their biological limitations. Each new revelation systematically dismantled every single point of his presentation. The primitive weapons were revealed to be adaptive systems designed to function in any environment against any opponent. The predictable emotional responses were shown to be carefully calculated psychological warfare tactics. The simple communication methods were demonstrated to be part of a complex multi-layered intelligence network. Ambassador Crix Yendel leaned forward, his expression shifting from confusion to horrified realization. "Professor Bellman," he said slowly, "where exactly did you obtain your research data?" Qorth's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. My research assistants compiled it from standard intelligence sources, the same databases we've always used for xenobiological studies." "And when was this data collected?" The timestamps showed Qorth's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. They showed recent acquisition dates, but the actual content was… Captain Santos advanced to her next slide, and the truth became unavoidable. The display showed a comprehensive timeline of human technological development, each with clear markers indicating when certain information had been deliberately released to galactic intelligence networks. Every piece of data that Qorth had used in his presentation had been carefully selected and distributed by humans themselves. The primitive species had been controlling the narrative about their own capabilities, feeding the galaxy exactly the information they wanted various species to believe. His research hadn't been academic investigation. It had been a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation, and he had been the unwitting puppet dancing to a human script. The audience was beginning to understand. Whispered conversations broke out among the delegates as they realized the implications. The Zephyrian representative actually stood up and walked out, clearly unwilling to remain in a room where his own species' intelligence capabilities had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered. And through it all, Captain Santos continued her silent presentation, methodically destroying every assumption the Galactic Council had ever made about human capabilities. She still hadn't spoken a single word. Captain Santos clicked to her next slide, and the amphitheater fell into a silence so profound that Qorth could hear his own circulatory system struggling to maintain basic function. The display now showed something that made every delegate in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats: recordings of private council communications. The first recording began to play, showing Ambassador Krix Yendel in what appeared to be his private office, speaking into a secure communication device. "The human problem needs to be addressed before it becomes unmanageable," his recorded voice said clearly. "We need academic justification for intervention policies." The timestamp showed the recording was from 6 weeks ago. Qorth felt his remaining dignity evaporate like moisture in a vacuum. The audience watched in growing horror as more recordings played, showing various council members discussing humans in terms that ranged from condescending to openly hostile. The Mukhtar delegation had apparently referred to humans as a potential contamination risk to civilized space. The hegemony representative had suggested preemptive containment measures. Every private conversation, every classified discussion, every supposedly secure communication had been monitored and recorded with crystal-clear audio and perfect visual quality. Captain Santos advanced to the next slide, which showed a detailed timeline of Qorth's research project. But this timeline included information that Qorth himself didn't have access to: internal communications between his research assistants, funding approval processes, and most damning of all, the sources of his data. Every single piece of information he had used in his presentation had been provided by shell companies, dummy organizations, and carefully constructed academic institutions that existed solely to feed selected intelligence to galactic researchers. "My research team," Qorth whispered, staring at the evidence of his own manipulation. "They said the sources were verified through standard academic channels." The next slide showed those standard academic channels. Universities that existed only on paper, research institutions staffed entirely by human operatives, peer review networks that had been manufacturing credible-looking but completely fabricated studies for years. Captain Santos revealed that humans had known about his presentation 3 weeks before he had even been assigned to give it. They had monitored the Council's decision-making process, identified Qorth as the selected presenter, analyzed his previous work to understand his biases and methodology, and then carefully crafted a data package that would lead him to exactly the conclusions they wanted him to reach. Every condescending statement he had made, every primitive behavior he had mocked, every limitation he had identified, all of it had been scripted by the same species he was insulting. The humans had played him like a musical instrument, using his own academic arrogance as the strings. They had understood his psychology better than he understood theirs, predicted his reactions with perfect accuracy, and manipulated him into delivering exactly the presentation they needed him to give. We've been dancing to their tune this entire time," Ambassador Krix Yendel said slowly, his voice barely audible. "Every policy decision, every assessment, every intelligence report, how long have they been controlling the information flow?" The final slide in this section showed a galactic map with communication intercept points marked in red. The coverage was complete. Every major trade route, every diplomatic channel, every military communication network, all of it had been monitored by humans for years. The species that the galaxy considered barely capable of interplanetary travel had been conducting the most sophisticated intelligence operation in recorded history, and they had done it so effectively that no one had even suspected their involvement. Captain Santos stood quietly beside the display, her expression unchanged, still maintaining her terrifying silence. The evidence spoke for itself with devastating clarity. The primitive species had outmaneuvered the entire Galactic Council without firing a single shot. Captain Santos clicked to her next slide, and Qorth's world collapsed entirely. The display showed a detailed psychological profile, not of humans but of him. Every academic paper he had ever written, every presentation he had ever given, every personal bias and intellectual weakness he possessed, all laid out with clinical precision. Strategic analysis. Professor Qorth Bellman, the slide read, predicted response patterns and exploitation vectors. She wasn't just an observer. She was a strategic analyst who had been studying him for months, preparing for this exact moment with the same methodical precision that Qorth thought he had been applying to humans. The next slide showed psychological profiles of every species represented in the Council. Zephyrians respond positively to hierarchical validation, vulnerable to appeals to crystal logic supremacy. Mokhtar, tribal decision-making patterns, easily influenced by perceived consensus. Hegemony, overconfident in technological superiority, blind to adaptive strategies. Each profile was accompanied by specific tactical recommendations for manipulation, influence, and control. The humans hadn't just been monitoring communications, they had been conducting comprehensive psychological warfare analysis on every major galactic civilization. Qorth stared at his own profile in horrified fascination. Subject exhibits classic academic narcissism, predictable response to perceived intellectual superiority. Recommend feeding confirmation bias through carefully selected datasets. Subject will unknowingly advocate for desired policy positions if provided with appropriately framed evidence. He had never been studying humans. They had been studying him. Every assumption he had made about their primitive psychology had been a projection of his own intellectual limitations. They had understood him better than he understood himself, predicted his reactions with mathematical precision, and orchestrated his entire presentation as a masterwork of psychological manipulation. Santos' silence hadn't been the passive response of a primitive being too stupid to understand insults. It had been active psychological warfare, designed to let him destroy his own credibility while she gathered intelligence on every delegate present. Every moment of her apparent stillness had been calculated to maximize his discomfort and expose his biases to the watching council. The primitive species had orchestrated the entire presentation as a power play, using Qorth as their unwitting representative to demonstrate their capabilities to the galactic community. They had turned his academic arrogance into a weapon against himself, his research into a tool for their own agenda, his presentation into their own tactical victory. My career, Qorth whispered, watching his professional reputation evaporate in real time. Everything I've worked for, every paper I've published, every theory I've developed, all of it was meaningless. He had been completely outmaneuvered by the same species he had considered barely intelligent enough to tie their own shoes. His decades of academic achievement had been reduced to a footnote in someone else's strategic operation. But the council delegates were no longer looking at the presentation. They were looking at him with a mixture of pity and horror, realizing that if humans could manipulate someone of his supposed intellectual caliber so completely, what did that say about their own vulnerability to human psychological warfare? Captain Santos remained silent, letting the magnitude of her species' tactical brilliance speak for itself. The amphitheater held its breath as Captain Santos prepared her final slide. For nearly an hour, she had systematically dismantled everything the Galactic Council thought they knew about humans without uttering a single word. The silence had become her signature, her weapon, her most devastating tool. And then, finally, she spoke. Thank you for participating in this evaluation of galactic prejudice and security assessment. Her voice was calm, professional, and carried the unmistakable accent of someone who had been born and raised in the heart of council space. One simple sentence that shattered every remaining assumption in the room. The final slide appeared. Official council documentation, humanity, founding member species, classification level, ultra-black. The authentication codes were genuine. The council seals were legitimate. The documentation showed that humans had been part of the Galactic Council since its inception, operating as the Intelligence and Security Division, while maintaining the carefully crafted illusion of being a primitive, recently contacted species. Qorth's mouth fell open as the implications cascaded through his consciousness like a quantum collapse. His entire presentation hadn't been an academic study of primitive humans. It had been a test. A comprehensive evaluation of which species harbored dangerous anti-human sentiments, which delegates could be trusted with sensitive information, and which civilizations posed potential security threats to Council operations. The Council hadn't been evaluating humans for membership. Humans had been evaluating the Council for security clearance. Santos had been conducting a loyalty assessment, using his presentation as bait to identify prejudiced thinking patterns among the galactic community. Every delegate who had laughed at his insults, every species representative who had nodded approvingly at his recommendations for benevolent oversight, every individual who had shown anti-human bias, they had all been catalogued, analyzed, and flagged for future monitoring. Your psychological profile has been updated to reflect security risk factors, Santos continued, her gaze settling on Qorth with clinical interest. Your expressed desire for species-based subjugation policies will be noted in your permanent record. Qorth realized with dawning horror that he had just volunteered himself as a security threat to the very organization he had thought he was serving. His academic presentation had become his own confession of dangerous ideological tendencies. He hadn't been studying primitive humans. He had been unknowingly auditioned for a watch list by the galaxy's most sophisticated intelligence apparatus. And he had failed the audition spectacularly.